For the imaginary, spawned by World War II, contained one embarrassment: the alliance with the communist dictatorship of the Soviet Union, without whose contributions and horrific sacrifices the Allied victory would have been highly problematic. Begin by identifying the subject and the type of paragraph. The subject is clearly going to be the alliance with the Soviet Union, and I'm assuming that's the United States alliance with the Soviet Union coming out of World War II, which was not a positive one, even though they fought on the same side of the war, clearly, from the first sentence. Secondly, the type of paragraph would look to be explanatory. It's going to explain more details about that relationship and why it was an embarrassment. Moreover, there are a lot of use of dates I can see right away. So World War II is the timeline given in the first sentence, but just quickly glancing, I can see 1917, 1920s, 1945, different date references. So this is also a chronological paragraph. Don't always get caught in the trap that it can only be one possibility. You could have combinations of paragraph types like that. With that, let's begin to underline our repeat words, pronouns, and transitions. R. The motive at that time was not solely geopolitical worries about the Bolshevik regime, but that regime's candidacy as an alternative to capitalism. Q. Distrust of this ally, this the pronoun, and I assume that refers to the Soviet Union, had its beginnings as far back as the Bolshevik Revolution. So again, we see Bolshevik as a repeat word, of 1917 and the Red Scare of the 1920s. S. The policymakers of the Cold War would decide that issue, that pronoun, not sure quite yet what that issue is, by assigning a huge proportion of the nation's resources to defense rather than welfare. U. The wartime imaginary. So again, we're repeating the word of the imaginary in the World War II, wartime, I presume, imaginary, was not abandoned after 1945, which of course is contemporaneous with the end of World War II, but reconceived as a Cold War, again, that's a repeat word from S, between the United States and the Soviet Union, a showdown between capitalism and anti-capitalism. T. The Cold War, again, repeat word, consolidated the power of capital, again, capital, repeated, capitalism, capital, and began the reaction against the welfare state, again, welfare state, war on the welfare state, defense rather than welfare, I should say. What was abandoned was all talk of participatory democracy, and the propaganda of business interests depicted the combination of social democracy and political regulation of the economy as simple socialism, and therefore the blood relative of communism. And again, we see the word communism repeated. Finished that process, we've read the paragraph, we've underlined what we think are key words, repeats, transitions, pronouns. What's the first step in putting the orders together? And we'll take about 90 seconds to 2 minutes to do that. In this case, to me, the most obvious sentence pairs are linked by the word Bolshevik. Distrust of this ally had its beginnings as far back as the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, Q, and the motive at that time was not solely geopolitical worries about the Bolshevik regime, but that regime's candidacy as an alternative to capitalism. So it looks to me R follows Q, and at that time refers to the Bolshevik Revolution, 1917, and the Red Scare of the 1920s. If we quickly think about S, U, and T, they are all using the word Cold War, and they're really talking about the period 1945 and after. So those three sentences, S, U, T, are kind of a block or a segment different than RQ. They're two different ideas here. One's the Bolsheviks, one's the Cold War. So I think the Cold War will come after, just chronologically, the Bolshevik Revolution. What would likely the order of S, U, and T be? The wartime imaginary was not abandoned after 1945. This is really introducing that this imaginary, from our original sentence, was not changed after 1945, this imaginary, but it was reconceived as a Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union. If I then look at the sentence S, the policymakers of the Cold War, again, reference to the Cold War would actually decide that issue, and I assume that issue is the fight between capitalism and anti-capitalism, by assigning a huge proportion of the nation's resources to defense rather than welfare. And T, the Cold War, again referring to that repeat word, consolidated the power of capital and began the reaction against the welfare state. So T indicates what the consequences of the Cold War was on capital and on communism, which makes it a nice summary or conclusion to the entire paragraph. Logically, we have QR as well-connected sentences. The beginnings of the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917 resulted in R, a fight between capitalism and anti-capitalism. And then we have the group or block of UST connected sentences, in which it then transitions to a later time, 1945, at the end of World War II, where that fight of capitalism versus anti-capitalism continues through the Cold War. I like the structure. Final ordering is QRUST.